Okay, welcome. This is part one of the lecture on composition and page structure that's related to our discussion about the Baroque. And we're talking about a number of different things here, and a lot of the things that we've been talking about are in some ways kind of like a combination of things that we've been talking about all the way through. We talked about hierarchy and emphasis earlier in the semester, and we talked about implied lines and value grouping in earlier parts, and all of them kind of come together in this topic. But they're also different because now we're talking not only about how those things happen with the shapes that are put on the canvas, but how they happen in terms of how they relate to the page structure, the actual format, proportion of the page or canvas that an artist is working on. And so there are a couple of things that we'll go over, like I can see from the outline here, we're going to talk about some of the stuff that we did, that we already have seen and already kind of familiar with. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the structure to any kind of page or blank canvas, and then how that relates to the decisions of placement and organization, and how that can make decisions that might be consonant, meaning harmonious and feel comfortable and feel at rest, versus decisions that feel maybe more active, or have more movement, or feel tense and awkward. Um, okay, so to begin with, we've been seeing hints of this all the way through. Like last unit, we were been talking about the Renaissance, and we'd already been talking about triangular compositions, like here, right, in this beautiful Raphael, and um, and so you can also see that same kind of composition, only even more complex, in these two Leonardos um, on the same theme. And you can see that in this diagram that a lot of people take this idea very seriously, of paying attention to not only kind of the implied grouping and implied lines, but how those things relate to these kind of lines, a line going from this corner to that midline corner, or from this corner all the way up to the top corner of the rectangle. Um, and so we've also seen lots of uses of implied lines and diagonals, like, most obviously implied lines like this kind of implied line, the pointing implied line, but also the implied line created by of movement of light, the transition from a lighter area to a less light area, right, and how that creates an area of focus. But also pay attention to the very subtle use of thirds in the breakdown of this composition. And we've also seen a number of compositions that we've talked about already where the use of the diagonals from corner to corner, like this diagonal right there, or the use of this diagonal from there to there, play a really important role in the composition. Or also, this diagonal is a little bit more subtle, because like the rock here doesn't go right up to the corner, but the tree kind of nicely fits, kind of reminiscent of this tree fitting into that corner. And the diagonals, of course, lead us to this important point of the composition. So we've been seeing that um, in a number of paintings. And that leads to this. You're probably wondering, what's that? Um, leads to talking about Rudolf Arnheim and some things that he said back in the 20s about the way decisions on a page work. Your eye can automatically see the difference between these two. There's a very, very subtle difference in placement between this circle and its square versus that circle and that square. And that circle, because of its placement, um, is more consonant, right? It's more stable. It doesn't feel like it's necessarily moving. It feels like it has found its spot. Whereas this circle, um, because it's slightly off, but also because it's not far enough off to then line up with the diagonal, right? So it's off of that diagonal, but it's also off from the center. That position for that circle is less consonant, less harmonious, but definitely less, uh, has more sense of potential, more energy. It feels like it's about to something. About to what? I don't know, but we shall see. This is kind of an exercise based on that principle that shows you um, how real this kind of principle is, right? The idea is you take these different positions where you organize two circles in ways that are slightly tense, potentially awkward, and then can you, by placing a third circle, create something more stable, right? So you can see that's based off of 1, 2.1 is based off of 2, right? And this is a great example of like how turning that into a diagonal going that way becomes much more stable. Um, and you can also see that some of them, there's no variation off of 10 because 10 itself is pretty stable. Um, but there are multiple variations on 8. So it gives you a sense of how decisions, these very small decisions about exactly where you place a mark compared to another mark, make a huge difference in a composition. And what Arnheim argued was that for any composition, right, in this case a square composition, but any kind of composition, there are going to be certain places that we automatically know, that our eye can measure where the mid lines are and where the diagonal lines are automatically, because we can automatically measure where the middle of this is, and the middle of that is, and the middle of that is. And you know, in class the other day while we were doing the painting workshop, we kind of just proved that point, that you can take any line and the human eye can pretty easily find how to divide that up. Um, so, knowing this, we can then start looking at paintings like this and see how that structure relates to it. This is a really great example. I've been showing this example forever when talking about this issue. And the reason is because if you look at this painting, and you think about it in terms of the subject matter, and you think about it in terms of the facial expressions on the figures and the gestures, this should be an incredibly chaotic and loud painting. It's a horrible scene. It's warfare. It's, you know, warfare at its worst, right? Soldiers pillaging an undefended city, you know, killing the old and the women and the children. It is, you know, it should be horrific. But there should be tons of movement. Look at the repetition of diagonals that we find throughout it, right? It should be a painting full of movement. And yet, when you look at it, it is a painting of quiet stillness, right? Um, and there are various reasons for that, some of them more painterly, having to do with his hand and the way he placed the color and his color choices and the color of the lighting, the mood of the lighting, and his overall love of classicism. But a lot of that stillness, that quietness to the whole painting has to do with the structure, the way he's thinking about the structure of verticals, you know, the halfway line. I just pointed with my finger, I should use the cursor, right? The way he's thinking about where the halfway line is, where the vertical halfway line is, where the corner to corner diagonals are, and all the divisions from there, and how so many things look at this grouping of figures and how they line up on that diagonal, right? All of those decisions, right? And look how this grouping there creates kind of like a triangle, a balanced triangle, and a balance of movement and of energies. And because they're kind of locked into the structure of the composition, everything is stable and therefore everything is still. And so it's both a scene of being of horror, of a truly awful event, but it's also a um, in a classical sense, it's perfectly restrained, and it has that feeling of being absolutely calm. So, and I believe that a lot of that has to do with, you know, composition and the structure. Okay, with the next part, we will start exploring some variations on that. I'll speak to you about that in a second.